Earlier in the year, the nation acknowledged VE Day, a date which many still think marked the end of World War II. So why are we now celebrating VJ Day? VE Day marked victory in Europe, and with that came the end of fighting in and around Europe and the threat to the civilians in our country. The sacrifices made by so many civilians and military personnel meant that VE Day was a cause for huge celebration. However, between May and August, the war in the East continued. Japan surrendered after the use of the atomic bombs on the 15th of August 1945, marking VJ Day, victory over Japan. The fighting in the Far East was vital to help conclude the war, and in many ways it was VJ Day which truly marked the end of the Second World War. Over 1 million service personnel, men and women, served in the Southeast Asian Command. The majority of them were from Commonwealth and Empire forces. Many of those who saw action in the Far East felt themselves to have fought a forgotten war. They returned home across the globe to often unrecognisable countries, which they hadn't seen for years. The prisoners of war in the Far East were released, some dying shortly after as a result of their mistreatment in captivity, and many suffering the rest of their lives. As we approach the 75th anniversary of VJ Day, it is important to remember those who served in the Far East, who continued the bitter fighting in the months between VE and VJ Day. I invite you to take part in a national moment of remembrance on Saturday, the 15th of August. There will be a 2-minute silence at 11 a.m. to remember all those who served and all those who lost their lives in the Second World War.
I'm Derek Forrest, and I'm the Armed Forces Champion for South Ribble, and it falls to me, of course, to mark VJ Day. My first knowledge of the war in the Far East came when, as a young article clerk, I joined a firm of solicitors in Preston. It quickly became clear to me that two of the partners and the senior cashier in the office shared one significant factor. They're all thin as wraiths. And it was only as I got to know Dennis Horton and Teddy Dixon and Charles, the cashier, I realised that they had all shared the same fate during the war. They were all of them members of 88th Heavy Field Artillery, and as such, having gone through a rather traumatic evacuation at Dunkirk, they were sent out to India with the 4th Indian Division. Unfortunately for them, just at that moment the Japanese decided to invade Malaya, and the result of that was that they went with the 18th Division to Singapore. Now that perhaps doesn't mean too much for the present generation, but to my generation it represents just about the biggest defeat that the British Army has ever suffered. Because what happened to the field artillery was they came off the boats and virtually straight away went into Japanese captivity. This meant that the three of them first of all went to the infamous Changi prison in Singapore, and then quite a lot of them ended up working on the Burma Railway. If you look on the internet, you can actually see a list of casualties and deaths that they compounded for that period, and it's as long as your arm. Not from bullets or anything like that, but from simple disease, starvation, and maltreatment by their Japanese captors. So that when eventually in 1945 they were returned to the UK, they were shadows of their former self, and they all happily lived long and indeed happy lives, but they never recovered the pounds that they lost in the jungles of Malaya in 1942 and onwards. The other thing I perhaps wanted to emphasize to people was that it wasn't just soldiers who were affected, or airmen or naval people, but civilians were affected by the war. Because my wife's grandfather was one of the Scottish engineers working on the Chinese railway. When the Japanese advanced into the enclave areas, the European areas of China, he went into a prison, a war camp for civilians. And whilst I don't suppose the treatment was quite as bad as that suffered by the British Army in Malaya, nevertheless, by the time 1945 came out and he had to be repatriated, he was already very weak, and sadly they flew him out. He landed in Calcutta and died in Calcutta, and is indeed buried in Calcutta. So he joins all those men of the 14th Army who we remember in VJ Day, the forgotten army. And it's my responsibility as Armed Forces Champion to remind those of 2020 of the sacrifices that were made by these men and their family, and indeed the civilians that support them.